Hey, it's Soul, and today's Shadowlands coverage is part of a series where I go over not the best Covenant abilities to salivate over, but 3 of the worst so far. Today it's going to be within the Venthyr Covenant. This is all about giving feedback. It's not to discourage you from liking a certain Covenant, but merely to point out what makes these abilities kind of meh. And to the best of my ability, I'm going to suggest tweaks and changes to make these more viable in most situations. Remember though that this is the alpha, and everything is subject to change, including what's going to happen with legendary armor and gear that's going to manipulate Covenant abilities as has been talked about, not to mention soul binds, these special talent trees with slottable augment called conduits that theoretically can also redefine Covenant abilities in many ways. For now though, let's go with what we've got. We begin our journey of disappointment with mages. They obtain an ability called Mirrors of Torment, which has a 1.4 second cast time and a 1.5 minute cooldown. It conjures 3 mirrors to torment the enemy for 20 seconds. Whenever the target casts a spell or an ability, a mirror is consumed to inflict shadow damage, and their movement speed and cast time are slowed by 15%. The third and final mirror will instead inflict nearly triple the damage of a single mirror, root, and silence the target for 4 seconds. So for PvP, this is a really strong ability for mages in situations where the enemy is unable to be cleansed. The mirrors proc on both instance and spell casts, and for the most part players want to hit buttons every chance that they can get. So a player hit with this has very little recourse other than to pop an immunity or otherwise let you, the mage, just get away. Mirror of Torment is a magic debuff though, so if there is a healer nearby, don't expect this buff or debuff to be very effective. The tragedy of this ability comes from its PvE applications. Unlike players, most mobs don't use 3 abilities within 20 seconds, and those that do, more often than not, will cast spells, which makes it less likely for these mobs to suffer that third and final mirror. The debuff that's applied to enemies, which is called Agonizing Backlash, also only applies to cast speed and movement speed, but not attack speed, which would be nice to have, even though a mage ought to be kiting enemies anyway. In the end, this ability is very situational. It doesn't silence the target until after the third ability or a spell cast, so it's not reliable, and the damage itself is pretty low, and even worse if the target isn't hit by all 3 mirrors. So here's my suggestion. How about making it an instant cast spell that you can apply, and also make it so that after 20 seconds, the remaining mirrors will detonate simultaneously for more than it would have if the mirrors were consumed from spell casts, so it doesn't have to silence, just make it do a little bit more damage instead. And in situations where enemies are immune to silence, well, the mirror can deal that extra damage instead. That gives this ability a bit more oomph in PvE, turns it into a useful damage cooldown, even if the utility isn't useful in every situation. Next stop on the sad train, we run into rogues. Rogues gain the Slaughter ability, which costs 50 energy and requires stealth to use. This ability also works if you spec into talents or use skills that allow the use of stealth-only abilities. It does reasonably high damage and grants 2 combo points, but it also immediately applies Slaughter Poison to your weapons, which is basically deadly and wound poison put together. The poison lasts for 5 minutes, and it overrides deadly, instant, or wound poisons if they're already applied. Let me be clear that rogues, like most classes, are not my cup of tea, so I apologize in advance if I'm missing something here. So for Outlaw and Subtlety rogues, this is an okay buff to poison applications because they don't have access to deadly poison. But currently for Assassination, it adds only the reduced healing effect because Slaughter Poison replaces deadly poison. And Wound Poison gives a bigger reduced healing effect after applying all of its stacks. Again, I don't have the proficiency, so I can't quite tell if having a 2 combo point builder on a stealth only ability is helpful. But as someone who's mostly enjoyed playing Assassination, Slaughter doesn't feel like it adds a whole lot, so here's what I'd suggest. Since Subtlety and Outlaw do get a poison upgrade and Assassination doesn't, I'm going to consider that those 2 specs are fine, so I'll focus a little bit more on Assassination. Maybe for them, Envenom can add an additional effect to Slaughter, like an increased rate of application to the poison, or higher base damage, or something else. The whole point is to make all 3 specs feel equally more powerful when using Slaughter. The third and final ability that I rank as the worst of the Venthyr Covenant abilities goes to Ravenous Frenzy for the Druids. It's an instant cast and on a 3-minute cooldown, and for 20 seconds, Druid spells or abilities that you cast increase damage, healing, and haste by 2%, and it stacks during that 20-second duration. However, while this buff is active, if you spend 1.5 seconds idle, as in you don't cast abilities or use things, the frenzy overcomes you, consuming 3% of your health per stack that you built up, it stuns you for a second, and the entire buff goes away. Almost everything about this ability sucks, so let's break it down. You gain stacks of this buff, or otherwise you avoid getting stunned by spamming abilities non-stop for 20 seconds, so there's a lot of planning involved here. You can only use this cooldown when you can consistently perform any action, from Moonfire spam to swiping the air to using rejuvenation on NPCs. The true horror comes from how easy it is to hesitate or fat finger and end up getting stunned. Then your ramp up is over, you lose HP, you lose your buff, and of course for that 1 second you can't perform any actions. In PvP, this is a horror show just waiting to happen. There could be a certain strategy with using this ability to build up a faster resistance to stuns, but it's more likely that you have a 20-second vulnerability to being stunned after a recent stun, or silence, or an incapacitate. Fortunately, there are some suggestions I can make to make this buff a little bit more attractive. First, the activation of Ravenous Frenzy could immediately apply a 10% buff to damage, healing, and haste, instead of starting from 0. To compensate, maybe the stacking buff can be dropped from 2% per stack to 1 or 1.5%. The other suggestion would be to make it so that if the druid does idle long enough and get stunned, they can keep the stacks that they've built, but they can no longer generate more stacks during that 20-second duration. So at the very worst, if you get stunned immediately, at least you get that 10 seconds buff to damage, healing, and haste. I think that would go a long way towards making this ability more viable and, probably more important, forgiving. These were, at least in my opinion, the 3 worst Covenant abilities for the Venthyr so far. Who knows though, this could change in a matter of days, or these could just be base abilities that get enhanced through soulbinds and craftable legendaries, so while I'm bummed out about these buttons at the moment, I'm excited to see what's in store as we progress through the alpha. I'd love to hear your thoughts and expertise on these abilities though. Maybe I'm dead wrong. Maybe I'm onto something. At any rate, share what you've got to say in a comment below and subscribe so you can get my coverage on the other Covenant abilities that I think might be crap and all things Warcraft. We'll see you later. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.